I think one of the mistakes workplaces make is to try to be so efficient that they lose the humanity of the people that are with them. So it shows up in these little ways that are pernicious and annoying. You go into a meeting and the leader talks at you the whole time because there's so much information that has to be shared and so much decisions that need to be made. I think that's a huge mistake. The leader should be using the time of the meeting to bring the ideas of other people into the room, to create a sense of healthy conflict and debate where so that decisions could be made together and buy-in would exist. But instead we feel the pressure of time. And so we push decisions down or we try to sway the decision with our leadership. I think that's a huge mistake that businesses make.
You're listening to Brainwork Framework, a business and marketing podcast brought to you by focus-biz.com.
Welcome back to another episode. With us today is Dr. Amber Johnson. She is the founder of AAJ. She's a leadership development consultant and coach with a specialty in communications. So excited to have her on today. Amber, welcome. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Hey, Chris. Good to be here with you. I'm doing great. Thanks.
Wonderful. We always like to ask our guests, tell us about your journey. What were you doing before? How did that kind of prepare you for what you're doing today?
Yeah. Are you familiar that campsite theory is just the little reminder that we should leave the world better than we found it? So if you leave a campsite, the goal is always to pick up the trash that somebody else maybe left there. You leave it better than you found it. And that was really sort of the philosophy my family raised me with. I graduated college with degrees in communications, and I thought, I want to leave the world than I found it. And I thought I would do that by marketing and communications in the nonprofit world. How could I bring the skill and the talent that it gets used in corporate world to this place where people are serving? And I really wanted to change the world. So I went on and I got a master's degree in communication. I studied how social movements work because I thought if I can figure out how they changed the world, then I can go do it. This was my idea. I did not know the fields of change management or organization development existed. I was a little naive. And I guess in the long term, I'm glad I didn't know it because I loved my education. But what I discovered was that my professors were super good at explaining why something happened, but they had no predictive ability, no ability to go say, if you do this and this and this, we can make good things happen. And I was so curious about that. How do we make the things we want to happen in the world come to pass? And I started working for the global humanitarian organization World Vision. I spent over 10 years with them. And they used, and my division especially, used this process called appreciative inquiry, which is a process of organizational change and leadership development that really asks you to look at the strengths of your organization and then design a future from there. And it was the solution I had been looking for. It was the answer of how can we take a group of people and move them from place A to place B and make the world better than we found it. And what was so fascinating to me about appreciative inquiry was that they did it through questions rather than through answers. This process used a set of standard questions that you could ask people over and over, modifying it just a little because the context matters so much. And that in answering the questions, whole communities of people, whole organizations could find new solutions that they'd never considered. And professionally, as my career developed, I got really good at asking questions. It was just a talent I had. So fast forward 15, 20 years, and now I'm a mom and I'm busy and I have teenagers and I'm driving my oldest to get their haircut. And my oldest, Sam, read a book the whole way. And every time I'd try to ask a question, I would get these one-word answers with not getting anywhere. And then we get to the salon and Sam sits in the chair and suddenly Sam can't stop talking to the stylist about their book. And I was like, what's going on? All these questions and you were silent and now you really want to talk to her. And I listened and I realized that it was because her questions were better than mine. I had asked, do you like the book? Is it the second in the series? And she asked, what do you like about this book? What do you like about strong characters? What is it about fantasy books that really appeal to you? She'd ask these wide open questions that gave Sam room to answer. And I had asked these questions that failed me. And I could not believe that as a professional, my expertise is questions. And as a parent, I was thinking at it, just total failing. And so it sent me on a journey to figure out, how do you ask a good question? Because I don't think that's something we're ever taught. You're a podcast host, so you've honed your ability to do this. There's some journalists and some psychologists who maybe have had a little bit of training in it, but the rest of us, communicate all day long without really connecting because we're not good at asking questions. And that's been my journey. So that's part of what I do as my professional practice and definitely as a personal passion.
I love that journey, and especially the fact that it was the social movement piece on how do we affect and change the world. How did that come to be, and what were their motivations, and how can we replicate that to affect the change? I love that piece. Communication is so important and something that improving on would help solve a lot of our world's problems. I feel it's the communication barrier that we have. We're speaking with too much emotion, or we're not communicating in a proper way, not asking the right questions. There's things we can be improving to help our communication practices. So I love all the work that you do. What changes have you seen from COVID? Because you've started in this, you worked through it. What changes have you seen since COVID within the communication realm?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. There's a lot of different ways to answer that because COVID coincides with other things happening in the world with the our political system and how polarized it has become and how that sneaks into our families and our workplaces in painful ways. It coincides with access to virtual technology and the changes that hybrid work and now getting called back to the office. There's just so many places that it overlaps. And I think one of the key places that I see communication necessary shifts in the workplace is around the idea of caring and connection and the idea that you are a whole person at work. And while I think that was in theory believed before 2020, or I don't know that it was in practice as necessary as it is now. And there's research that indicates that we need now more to feel care and support and dependability from our leaders. And before we may have valued their strength and their charisma, at an interpersonal level now, we need to know that we can show up as a whole person and that what's happened in the news, what's happened in our personal lives, even the emotions of our work experience are safe to be considered at work. And I think that's a central communication is a central responsibility in that. As we learn to face our emotions, then we have to learn how to communicate them with responsibility as well.
Absolutely. What do you think businesses are missing out on or doing wrong in terms of communication? What can they be doing better? What should they focus on? Because it's different. It's a different workforce, as you said, there's all these different factors at play now
Mhm.
that are now impacting that. Some are going towards hybrid work now and say, hey, you can work from home or offering some benefits. What should businesses kind of be focusing on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hear from my clients all the time that work is more and more, add more, go faster, do more, don't take anything off your plate. Burnout is closer than it maybe ever was before. People feel it. We're more aware of it in our post pandemic nature as well, how thin that line is between I'm okay and I'm really not okay. And in this context of so much more, it feels as if so much more is expected of us. We cannot slow down. We cannot feel the threat of burnout at our heels. In that context, I think one of the mistakes workplaces make is to try to be so efficient that they lose the humanity of the people that are with them. So it shows up in these little ways that are pernicious and annoying. You go into a meeting and the leader talks at you the whole time because there's so much information that has to be shared and so much decisions that need to be made. I think that's a huge mistake. The leader should be using the time of the meeting to bring the ideas of other people into the room, to create a sense of healthy conflict and debate where so that decisions could be made together and buy-in would exist. But instead we feel the pressure of time and so we push decisions down or we try to sway the decision with our leadership. I think that's a huge mistake that businesses make. And another huge one is that we do keep adding without subtracting and without asking the questions about what is really necessary.
Absolutely. And from business to personal relationships, the communication practices can benefit both sides of that. You mentioned how to keep relationships fresh and the communication piece.
Yeah.
One really insightful thing that I read online was a communication piece was to get curious before you're furious. So this was how you react to a situation going into it by asking
Mhm.
the right questions can help change your mind. Do you have any input on that as far as how we approach situations and maybe help help build relationships?
Yeah. Central rule for me is to turn criticism into curiosity or complaints into curiosity. So when someone brings you something, then you feel their emotions. Our tendency is to respond to their emotion, and that just amps up the energy of the conversation. And that isn't always when our emotions are heightened, isn't the place to have the real rational conversation. So if you can instead get curious, really seek to understand without being defensive, without being needing to explain your reasoning or thinking, but actually understanding what are they trying to say? Why is it important to them? Why does it matter so much? What am I missing? If you can dig into that with your questions and with your body language as well, I think people will find so much more understanding and probably more common ground to get to whatever the next step is as well.
Those are some really great points. I love that. And in line with the communication piece, you mentioned asking the questions. After that, what do we need to do? We need to listen, right? We need to actually
Good.
take that time because communication is that two way. What does listening play in the communication piece? How do we approach that?
Yeah. There's a saying that Americans don't listen to hear, they listen to reload. Like while you're talking, I'm loading up whatever I'm going to say next and getting ready for it to come out. And it is so true. And even when we have conversations with people we're trying to build relationships with, they share maybe about a medical thing, and then we share about our own medical thing instead of actually asking a question back. Right. So my assurance to people is that the conversation almost always circles back to don't work so hard to get your own opinion and your own voice into there, particularly in relationship conversation. Maybe in the workplace, we need to be more assertive, but in relationship conversation, get really curious about the other person before you share your own thoughts. That has like the secret benefit. First of all, the other person is going to find you more likable. The research actually says that we like people who ask us questions. But the second thing it does is that when you do get around to sharing whatever is important to you, you're really going to share something that they're more interested in, more on board with, more tailored to meet their needs and their concerns. And in a work context, you're likely to get the conversation further towards where you want it to be because of the interest you showed them.
Yes, absolutely. With being in business for so long, what are you looking forward to in 2025 here? Do you have some new initiatives you're putting in place? Are you maintaining what you're doing? Are you excited about putting anything out there?
Yeah, personally, I've been working on a book for a long time, and I feed pieces of the book and its ideas at my Substack. And I just love when I hear something helped somebody, that a question or a way to frame a conversation was useful. I get these emails that are like, how were you inside my head to know what I needed today? And so I am absolutely delighted to spend this year helping people have better conversations so they can have stronger relationships and more meaningful and productive work.
I love that. Do you offer any resources available? We're going to share the links available down in the show notes and the description here. You mentioned your Substack. We'll have that available
Yeah.
as well as your LinkedIn. Is there anything else available to the community who want to learn more?
Yeah, well, the Substack is free. I want to say that up front because I know we all have subscription fatigue from the feed that gets charged everywhere. So this is a free, be a better parent, a better partner, a better leader in 5 minutes a week. That's my pitch through your communication. And beyond that, coming out in February, I have a free download of questions you can ask instead of how are you? And here's the reason why. How many times do you ask, how are you? And Chris, what do you think? What do
All the
people say?
all the time. It's my go-to.
Yes. And when you ask it, what are the answers you get?
Good, could be better, about the same as usual.
Hanging in there. My husband and I call it the BFW response, which stands for Bibby Fine, whatever. People aren't giving you anything real. And so if we're going to break that script and not just communicate, but actually connect with people, it helps to ask other questions. So I have coming out in February a download of 50 questions you can ask instead of how are you? So you get more conversation going with your partner, your kids, your colleagues, your neighbor, whoever it is.
I love that. One thing you mentioned was how you communicate and speak with your children. Can we flip the script? What can we do as far as maybe our generation speaking to our parents as well? Because there's big differences, right? What can we do to better our communication style with our parents?
Yeah, as an adult, how do you talk to your adult parents? I think good questions and curiosity are the first step in active listening, like you said earlier. You're not going to get the door open without that. I also find a lot of strength in what I call naming the dynamic, which is to say, like, hey, mom, you and I don't always sit down and have heart to hearts. That hasn't really been our style. But I've found myself wondering and ask a question. And somehow by naming, this may feel awkward, but I know I don't normally do this, but I've been wondering, that's naming that dynamic. It gives us this permission to do the awkward thing or to open the door in a different way. It almost sends a signal to people to behave a little better, to take what you're saying seriously, that you aren't asking it flippantly with expecting a scripted response. And so it's an invitation to conversation that comes from it's a little more honest and vulnerable. And I think it's a great open door.
I like that strategy just to kind of call out the elephant in the room and say, hey, this is what we're working with, and then lead into it. Like you said, it kind of asks permissions first and then allows you to lead
Love
into
it.
it. That's very
Yeah.
smart. Speaking kind of this difference between the shift in power, I feel like when we become adults, from kids to adults, speaking to adult
Mm,
parents, the workplace changes that we're going to experience. It used to be very strict, dedicate your life to your job versus now where it's a bit more relaxed and the relationships, the purpose,
mhm.
the ideas of the organization matter a bit more. What do you kind of see the trend changing into, or what was the most exciting change in the trend that you've seen in terms of communication and workplace dynamics?
Yeah. Did I say anything earlier that you can
You
repeat? I'm trying to
probably did, and
remember.
I'm reiterating the question again. It was maybe in pre-interview. I didn't ask this question specifically. The newer generation that's going to be coming into the
Mm,
workforce. How do you see that
yeah.
kind of adapting
Yeah.
into our workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. And I think one of the things I'm very aware of because I have a senior in high school is that there are 4 or 5 generations actively in the workforce at one time right now. And we are wildly different in temperament and how we were raised. My children's generation has been raised with the ideas of emotional intelligence, with being very fluid and literate in our emotional language. They've been raised with a sense that they can advocate for themselves and that there should be boundaries around their work and their schoolwork. As a Gen Xer, I was raised that I was the early generation of the Blackberries and I worked in an international organization. And if I got a 2 a.m. email, I responded at 2:01. This was how I was raised. This is what leadership and responsibility looked like in my generation. And I don't think this will fly anymore in the face of the new generation. And we are in such a global society, we're always on somewhere. And so I am excited to learn about boundaries for myself. I'm excited to watch organizations grow more comfortable in drawing them. And I think it's going to produce all sorts of interesting communication challenges as we learn to work asynchronously, not just with our colleagues in China who are working different shifts than we are, but with our neighbors down the block who are taking 2 hours off in the middle of the day to pick the kids up from preschool and move them to daycare. And our lives are going to have to become, our communication is going to have to be just as fluid as our lives are. And I think that's going to be such an interesting challenge, especially as we overlay the expectations of generation.
Absolutely. That was something I didn't even consider is having 4 to 5 generations in a workforce. So you need to have something that appeals to all of them, communicates well to them. And sometimes you do need to take it on that more micro level to speak with the individual, the person, as opposed to the workforce as a whole or their generation as well. So that communication piece is so important. Is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you're excited to tell people about or chat about? Just want to open the floor for you.
Do you know when this will be aired or like when you post this? I don't want to talk about New Year's sort of things if you're going to
Of
do it in
course.
April or something.
Yeah, so I do think it'll be like March or April for release. A lot of people may have already forgotten their New Year's goals, but it could still be relevant up to you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. It's the spring. And I was raised in a generation that did spring cleanings. You open the windows, get the cobwebs out of the corners. And my challenge to people would be I don't care about your house, whatever, let it be dirty, but spring clean your communications. Look for conversations that are in the rut. And ruts for me stands for conversations that are too routine, conversations where the uncertainty is so great, conversations that are tense, or conversations that are serious, truly serious. Look for those conversations and ask yourself, what cleaning do I need to do in my life this spring to have those conversations well, to not just communicate, but to truly connect and to use them as ways to build stronger relationships and have more meaningful, productive work to get the results that you want, the impact that you want. Spring is actually a great time for that. There's so many transitions happening, graduations, all those sorts of things. This is a great time to ask ourselves, what can I be doing to clean up those areas of my life that maybe haven't gotten off to the right start this year? How could I leave that?
I love that. It's something that we need to kind of take a look back, take a step back, and look at what things we want to keep with us, the communication styles, the friends, the relationships that we want to focus our time on. So important. We appreciate you coming on to our podcast and sharing all these great tips and tricks with us. Hopefully we can have you on for a part 2 a year from now to see how things have changed. Dr. Amber
Yeah.
Johnson, we appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It was a delight.
Thank you so much.
That was really fun, actually. Thank
That
you.
was wonderful.